Hey, Ray, welcome to the Simplifying Entrepreneurship podcast. It's great to have you back here today.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate you having me back.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited today to talk all about language. And language, you and I are both coaches. There's so much stuff around the language we use in our businesses, the language that other people are using with us, and all of the things around that, whether it's for our businesses or our personal lives. Language is such a key piece of what we do every day. And people seem to underestimate it sometimes, but it's very powerful.
I absolutely agree. It's how we take our inner world and express that to the outer world, right? It is, like you said, whether it's in a coaching relationship or in a leadership role, how we communicate with the people around us, it makes all the difference.
It does. You know, when with the work that you do, how do you sort of break up the different parcels of language? And when you're looking at some of this stuff, you're very good at picking your language. In all of our conversations that we have, and we speak fairly regularly, every morning on a Clubhouse room, Empowered Life, and we're there talking to people, talking to our each other. But all of those things, you craft your words. Tell me a little bit about how you arrange that, why you do it, and the power of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Pete. So, two beliefs. One comes from my field of study, and that's the idea that the meaning of communication is the response that we get, right? So the meaning of communication is the response that we get. So the way that I interpret that is it doesn't matter what I say, it matters what you hear. Now, because of that, and this is another belief that I hold, or just something I work to live by with my language, is that I believe that precision in language is important, and it's not just precisely trying to express what I desire to get across, it's to formulate that communication in a way that it's best received by the person that I'm trying to communicate that to.
Yeah, I mean, I know we look at things. Some people look at things visually, right? Other people hear, they're auditory, and other people are more tactile. Talk a little bit about that and how we're framing some of the language, even around how people absorb the language.
I love that question, Pete. So you're absolutely right that we all have visual, auditory, kinesthetic components to how we take on the world, right? We have our 5 primary senses: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory being smell, and gustatory being taste. And we typically experience the world visually, auditorially, and kinesthetically. Just to clarify that, most people aren't going around smelling other people to see if they like them or licking walls to see where they are, right?
Yeah.
So having said that, yes, we all experience the world using those 3 primary: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, and we typically lean on one. And we hear this in language. You may have someone who says, "I see what you're saying," or "I hear what you're saying," or "Yeah, I feel ya." And when we start to identify that, and we can start to speak to people in the language in which they're speaking to themselves, it just resonates in a different way with that individual, and we can communicate with them in the way that they're currently communicating with themselves, and it's so powerful.
So when you're doing that, are you saying basically, like if somebody says, "I hear you," you should be saying, "Do you hear me?" When, those kind of things? Are we mirroring essentially? Is that the suggestion?
That's a great strategy. You can use those words back, and if there's enough of that, even something a second ago where I made the comment, it resonates with people, right? Resonating, that's an auditory word, right? So absolutely, if I notice that, repeating back those words, going in that same, see, can you visualize that? What picture popped into your head? All of those types of words, I'll stay in that vein.
Yeah. No, I love that whole concept. And I mean, that's an NLP concept, right?
It is. And NLP, without going into the long history of neurolinguistic programming, it was based on modeling, and what the founders and creators of NLP did was they went out and they just modeled excellent communicators, and they found that this was something that those great communicators were doing. They were identifying how people were expressing themselves, and they found a way to identify what those are and then be able to model those language patterns to better connect with people.
Yeah. What are other great ways that people can learn or maybe even acknowledge or understand better on using proper language?
That's a great question, Pete. So we've talked about the idea of the representational systems, the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic. Other ways in which we can use our language is if you've ever spoken to someone and maybe you've heard these sayings before, like their head is in the clouds or they're stuck in the weeds, right?
Yeah, sure.
Well, some people will use more abstract language, right? And those are, potentially big picture thinkers. They aren't necessarily in the weeds, right? And then you have the people who are in the weeds, and then you start talking about these big ideas, and they just get overwhelmed, right? So even the abstraction or the specificity of our language, there are a lot of different ways that we can recognize how people are communicating, what's going on inside of them, and then, as you said, match and mirror, right? We can mirror that language, or we can match that language.
Yeah.
And through that process, if we can meet people where they are, we can slowly start to guide them in other directions. Meaning that if I am speaking to someone, maybe a coaching client who is, they are just thinking big picture, right? And they can get stuck. They can get stuck there, and they don't know that first step to take. Well, if I can meet them there, and I can slowly guide them into the details, well, that takes flexibility and language on my part. Right?
Yeah.
Because again, going back to the idea that the meaning of communication is the response that we get, I need to meet them where they are to potentially move them to another place.
I love that. The meaning of communication is the response that we get. And I know you've said that already, but why don't you explain that just a little bit more for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you believe what I believe, that to mean that it doesn't matter what I say, it's what you hear.
Yeah.
Right? Well, going back to that idea of the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic, I have a good friend, and when we were having this conversation around that, around that idea of the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic, she got this like little smile on her face, and it was like a light bulb went off, and she just goes, "That makes so much sense. Why I'm visual, and when people say, 'Do you hear what I'm saying?' I feel like they're yelling at me," right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what I say, it's what she heard.
Yeah, I love that.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So powerful when we can start to identify that. And, we have to take that as feedback. And this is why that flexibility, whether someone's in sales or a leadership role or whatever that is, our ability to identify and see see how people are taking on the language that we're presenting to them, well, we can then adapt accordingly to communicate and create better relationships, build trust faster. So many different benefits come from that.
Yeah, a lot of people that listen to this podcast are entrepreneurs and in sales. I mean, most entrepreneurs are in sales because they own their business and they're leaders, and every leader is selling. How can we use this to be better salespeople?
Excellent. And it's such a phenomenal question. And I think that, I have a quick example I can share, and I think for your business owners, I think that this is applicable, or anyone. It's the recognition that different words mean different things to different people. And there's this great exercise that I learned years ago. And, let's say you have a bunch of people in front of you, and I would set this up to say, hey, I'm going to give you a word. And in a moment, I'm going to give you a word, and I want you to write down the first 5 words that come to mind. And in exercise, I often give the word success. So if you're listening and you want to try this with the word success, have the people in front of you write down the first 5 words that they think of when they hear the word success. And every time I've done this, Pete, I've done this in, smaller groups, 10, 12 people, all the way up to hundreds of people. And it's so phenomenal that no one ever has the exact same 5 words. Occasionally you get people that get 3, and, if there's going to be, whatever fraction of the room, maybe they have 1. And what that tells me is that if we're having a conversation and your 5 words are money, Vegas or whatever it is, and mine's like charity and, all of those things, and I ask you, do you want to be successful? And you're like, yeah. I'm like, great, let me show you how to be successful. Well, we're having 2 different conversations.
Yeah. It's the same. It's the same from our perspective. It's the same, but again, from their perspective, it could be very different, right? Because they're hearing it differently.
Absolutely. Right?
And I really think that's an interesting perspective. And I'm so glad you brought that up today, in the fact that we need to be conscious about this stuff when we're talking to people. We need to be conscious about, and instead of just talking, that's where I like to say, we need to have big ears and a small mouth. And from that perspective, really need to listen to their language in order for us to use the appropriate language for them.
Absolutely. And, I think it's appropriate to ask, right?
Yeah.
I think it's appropriate to ask and find out what those things mean. And there are a lot of books written on the topic, even things like the 5 love languages, right? You hear people talk about, quality time. Well, what does quality time mean to you? Because, I'll tell you, my girlfriend and I, we have drastically different definitions of quality time.
Right.
Mine could be sitting on the couch for 2 hours watching a show together. Hers is me talking to her for 2 hours. Neither is right or wrong. They just mean 2 totally separate things.
Yeah, and ultimately it's still called quality time, right? So it's quality time for you, quality time for her, but 2 different things. And that's I think where the main problems lie, is the generic sort of terms and phrasings of these things, and how we perceive things often creates confusion on the other person's part. And that's where we get the disconnects. We get disconnects with our customers, we get disconnects with our, family, we get disconnects with our friends, because we just assumed that crazy word, make an ass out of you and me, right? We assumed that they knew what we were talking about.
Right. And in certain situations, contextually it could be appropriate. If I say I'm angry in the middle of a conversation, chances are you aren't going to stop me and say, so what exactly do you mean by angry, right? Because you've experienced it before. And in those situations where, hey, I want to help you be successful, well, if I just assume I know what that means for you, versus asking, hey, what does success look like for you? Or, what would it sound like if you were successful here, right? Again, going back to that visual auditory.
Yeah.
Asking those questions and figuring out what it means to the individual, it matters. And in sales, that matters, right? What would a win in this relationship look like for you, rather than just assuming that what I'm about to present is the win? That matters.
Yeah, for sure. Ray, give us another tip around language that you might have up your sleeve that our listeners would like to hear.
So here's a great one for helping people uncover resources. And this is, it's a phrase, if you will. So occasionally as a coach, or you're leading people, and you may ask someone, they come to you and they present some sort of challenge, right? And, we've talked about this before, where you can be a professional problem solver, or you can help them to uncover whatever solution they need. And you'll have people say things like, well, I don't know what to do here, right? And this language right here, very simple to help them uncover. It's very simply, well, hey, I get it. I hear it. I recognize that you're saying you don't know. Hey, if you did know, what would a solution be? And when we start to use language like that, if you did know, what would a solution be? And it's amazing what that starts to uncover. So far, we've talked about language of communicating, and we can also use these phrases to help people unlock stuff that's already inside of them. So I encourage people to give it a try. Someone says, well, I don't know. Hey, cool, you don't know. If you did know, what would it be? And it's amazing how resourceful people can be when we use the appropriate language to draw those resources out of them.
What I just kind of heard on another talk the other day about the idea around brainstorming, and the fact that if you put that person into somebody else's shoes, like if you said that and then you said, well, what do you think Steve Jobs would have done? Or what do you think Elon Musk would do in this situation? Or any of those things? What do you think whoever would do? What do you think about that idea as far as opening up the language into that same question?
I think that when it's the right person, it puts them in an absolute growth mindset. It's funny you say that. Years ago when I was in sales, I used to hear that a lot. Well, if this person were in your territory, what would they be producing? And that was kind of like that, right? I think it gets people thinking outside of the box, because they recognize other people may be doing things or thinking ways that they don't think. Yeah,
like if the bottlenecks were removed here for you, what would you do? And those kind of things. Yeah, there's so many interesting ways to use language. I really appreciate our talk here today, Ray. And I'd love to have another chat with you upcoming soon again. Our listeners loved the first one, and I'm sure they'll love this one too. Tell everybody how they can get a hold of you, and if there's anything that you want to add into that, go ahead, feel free.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Pete. You mentioned a little bit ago where they can find us. That's on Clubhouse every morning at 6
Yeah,
a.m. Eastern Time. We talk a lot of language in there, right? So if this
we
is a
do.
topic that interests people, they can join us there. And yeah, if anyone has any questions on this, my website is mycoachray.com. And this is, I use language to help people create breakthroughs in their lives. So it's something that I'm passionate about and something I have the opportunity to use with clients. And I appreciate you asking the question.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thanks so much for spending some time here again, Ray, and looking forward to seeing you again probably tomorrow morning.
I appreciate it, Pete. Thank you.
Make it a great day.
You as well.
Okay, bye.